Thanks to Jijuan for all of his arrangements on arranging this, which I think will prove eventually to be quite interesting. So uh, I've completely revised my remarks since my first draft. And I think what Jijuan is really getting at is the notion that we've been working on this for quite some time, and we're not having a big impact. So what can we do to have a bit more impact? And so I've tried to understand what are the obstacles that we are encountering. And so let me note a few obvious obstacles. The one that's most obvious in my mind, which I'll return to, is that if you're doing science, it's important to be aware of what it is that you're working with. And in the case of physics and the physical sciences, you're dealing with objects in the real world. In the case of social science, you're dealing with human beings, which are quite different in that they're cognitive beings and they create worlds and reshape worlds, etc. So that there's a big difference between the stuff that physicists deal with and the stuff that social scientists deal with. And my basic notion is that the reason, or at least the reason why I'm interested in second order science, is because I think it offers us the opportunity to improve the social sciences and the way that we're going about social science, and to incorporate social science into the larger conception of science. So the basic element, there is, in my view, a great difference between inanimate objects and human beings because of their cognitive capabilities. Okay, now the structure of the universities, that is the context in which we're operating, suggests that the way to cope with knowledge, to organize knowledge, is to specialize, because the world is complicated, academic fields are complicated, so the way to deal with it is to choose a piece of it, become an expert in the piece of it, and that makes a certain amount of sense, but it tends to neglect the holistic problems, which are particularly of interest to social systems, because large social problems tend to be quite multidisciplinary. And if you focus on specialization, there's a tendency to neglect historical context. And I think historical context is really important. This was, I was alerted to this notion when I attended an INET conference, that's Institute for New Economic Thinking, where the economists were complaining about the fact that the history of economic thought was no longer taught in universities. And so I asked a few economists on my campus. They said, yes, I never studied the history of economics when I was a student, and we don't teach the history of economics now to the students. And this surprised me greatly. So, how do you chart the evolution and the progress of a scientific field if you're not paying any attention to the history of the scientific field? So historical context is important. Also, I learned just recently that in Europe, students study the history of philosophy for 2 years in high school, which doesn't happen in the United States. And consequently, they arrive at the university with a conception of the nature of knowledge as a historical phenomenon, the tree of knowledge, if you want to call it that, where fields progress from a philosophical understanding to a theoretical understanding to applications. So there's a fundamental difference at a very deep level between education in the US and education in Europe. And since cybernetics tends to be rather philosophical, this makes it very difficult for Americans to understand. Another point that was pointed out to me by Carl Mueller when we were doing this special issue on second order science was that there's something called action research, which is using social science knowledge to work with organizations and improve the performance of organizations. And I've encountered some methods of action research, I'm sure most of you have, and I find them very useful and very thought-provoking. But in the academic community, action research tends to be a peripheral activity, something that you can sort of do on the side if you want, but it's not really fundamental to research, which is stuff that's published in academic journals, which very few people read, but nevertheless, it's peripheral to it. So my thought is that the purpose of second order science is to reflect on these difficulties that are impeding the progress of social science and call attention to them and try to change them. So if you want to expand the conception of science to include the observer, the notion that the observer makes a difference, the idea that theories in the social sciences affect the behavior of the phenomenon, that is, a theory of physics won't change the way elementary particles operate, but a theory of economics will change the way economic systems operate, and so on. So we can expand science by adding new dimensions. This was an idea that Václav Krajewski added, the correspondence principle, that each new major progress in science should be represented by a new dimension. And so Heinz suggested one new dimension, include the observer. Another new dimension would be look at how theories have affected the phenomenon that you study. And a third would be consider the notion of design. That is, human beings design their systems and then they create their systems. And if you add those three dimensions, it seems to me like you have expanded science. And those are my interests.